The lake was still that morning, mirrored glass stretching beneath a pale blue sky. Margaret stood by the window of her modest lakeside home, her hands curled around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. At 68, she had grown used to the quiet. Too used to it, perhaps. The rhythm of her days had fallen into predictable silence, watering the garden, knitting by the fire, rereading novels whose endings she already knew. And yet, that morning, she was restless. Her grandson, Daniel, was coming to visit. It had been nearly 8 months since she'd last seen him, not counting the sporadic video calls or the occasional text message. He was 22 now, taller, busier, and, from what his mother said, thriving at university. But Margaret had always felt a special bond with him, one that distance couldn't quite sever. She had raised him for several years when his parents were caught up in their careers. They used to spend afternoons baking banana bread, walking along the lakeshore, and talking about everything and nothing. She'd cleaned the house twice that week. Made his favorite lemon scones. Even laid out the old patchwork quilt on his bed, the one she'd sewn when he was 10. Everything had to be just right. When she heard the gravel crunch under tires outside, her heart jumped. She hurried to the front door, smoothing her blouse, willing herself to stay composed. But the moment she saw him step out of the car, tall and broad-shouldered, grinning that familiar crooked grin, her composure crumbled. "Daniel," she called, her voice breaking with joy. "Grandma," he replied, rushing up the steps to wrap her in a tight hug. But then Margaret noticed something, or rather, someone else. A young man stood a few steps behind Daniel, slightly awkward, hands stuffed in his jeans pockets. He had warm brown skin, a quiet confidence, and eyes that held a shadow of something unreadable. "Grandma," Daniel said after they pulled apart, "this is Ethan. He's my roommate at school. I hope it's okay. I asked if he could come along for the summer. Things have been rough at home for him, and I thought some peace and quiet might do him good." Margaret blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't planned for another guest, but the sight of the boy's hesitant smile tugged at something in her. "Of course it's okay," she said warmly, stepping aside to let them in. "Any friend of Daniel's is welcome here." Ethan's expression softened. "Thank you, ma'am. None of that now," she said with a wink. "Call me Margaret." They settled in quickly, Daniel rambling about finals and professors as they carried their bags upstairs. Margaret watched them disappear down the hall, then stood alone in the living room for a moment, absorbing the hum of life that had returned to her home. The laughter echoing off the old wood-paneled walls, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, it all stirred something in her, a long-forgotten warmth that had lain dormant in the quiet years since her husband passed. Later, they gathered around the dining table, where she served a hearty roast and buttery potatoes. Ethan was quiet but polite, his smile modest, his laughter easy. Margaret found herself watching him more than she intended, noticing the way he listened when others spoke, the way his shoulders relaxed the longer he stayed. By the time dessert was served, the house no longer felt like a shell of what it had been. It felt like home again. Margaret didn't know it yet, but Ethan's arrival was about to reshape not only her summer, but the way she saw herself, her loneliness, and the boundaries she thought were unmovable. The lake remained still that evening, but inside her heart, something had begun to ripple. Margaret couldn't explain it, at least not in any way that made sense to her. The feeling had started subtly, like the first tremor before a storm. Ethan was polite, thoughtful, the kind of young man any grandmother would be proud to see her grandson befriend. But as the days passed, Margaret began to notice more than just his good manners. It wasn't anything inappropriate. Not at first. It was the way he lingered in the kitchen after meals, helping her rinse dishes while Daniel retreated to the porch with his guitar. Or the way he listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole presence, when she spoke about the garden, or the small-town library where she volunteered, or her late husband, Arthur. Ethan's responses were never rushed or obligatory. He was genuinely interested. And that interest began to soften something in her, a part of herself she had folded away for years. One afternoon, Margaret stood on the back porch, watching Ethan mow the lawn. The hum of the engine buzzed in her chest as she sat with a glass of lemonade, the sun dipping low across the lake. He moved with quiet focus, his posture relaxed but deliberate. Her attention lingered longer than she should have, eyes tracing the way the light glinted off his skin, the curve of his shoulders beneath his t-shirt dampened by summer heat. She gently admonished herself for it. "You're 68, Margaret. Stop this foolishness." But still, the thoughts crept in. When Ethan caught her eye and gave a small wave, she smiled, and felt something flutter inside her. That night, as she sat alone in her room, brushing her silver hair in the mirror, Margaret tried to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about how he made her feel, seen, listened to, important again. After Arthur's death, and as Daniel had grown more independent, she had quietly accepted the idea that her romantic life, her emotional life, was over. That season had passed, and yet, something about Ethan stirred embers she didn't know were still burning. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the novelty of having company again, the laughter in the house, the hum of conversation echoing in rooms that had been silent for too long. But even when she was alone, tending to her roses, or lying in bed with her book unopened in her lap, Ethan lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't love. She knew that. But it was something: curiosity, warmth, maybe even lingering impression, and that terrified her. It had been decades since Margaret had felt that kind of a stir of emotion. Not since Arthur's warm touch in the kitchen, or the long talks they used to have on this very porch, watching the stars. She believed those feelings had been laid to rest with him. Or so she thought. But Ethan, with his quiet presence and kind eyes, had unearthed them. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't dare say anything, not to Daniel, certainly not to Ethan. But she couldn't ignore it either. Each morning, she reminded herself, "You're a grandmother. He's just a guest." And each evening, she felt that line blur, just a little more. The summer air was thick with the scent of lilac and fresh-cut grass, and inside Margaret, something long dormant had begun to bloom. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, like steam beneath a kettle, quiet, invisible, but unmistakably there. Margaret found herself adjusting her routines without realizing it. She lingered in the kitchen longer when Ethan was around. She wore earrings she hadn't worn in years. She even caught herself laughing, full, real laughter, at his jokes, as though the sound had been sleeping inside her and he'd stirred it awake. One evening, after Daniel had gone to town to visit a friend, Ethan offered to help Margaret prune the back garden. The golden hour cast a soft haze over the yard, the air warm and fragrant with honeysuckle. They worked side by side, hands brushing occasionally over the tangle of stems. They spoke quietly, about his studies, about her late husband, about everything and nothing. The way Ethan listened reminded her of Arthur in their early years, when love was still new and the world still soft. At one point, Margaret lost her grip on a heavy pot and Ethan caught it just in time. Their hands met, and for a brief second, neither of them let go. She remained within the bounds of propriety. "I've got it," he said softly, his voice calm, but his eyes searching hers. "Thank you," she whispered, and quickly turned away. They didn't speak of it. Not then, but something had shifted. Later that night, Margaret stood by the living room window, staring out at the moonlit lake. She hadn't heard Ethan come in. When she turned around, he was standing in the doorway, quiet, still, like he'd been watching her for some time. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice gentle. He shook his head. "I keep thinking about this summer." "About here?" Margaret nodded. "It's been good to have company again. You boys have brought life back into this house." Ethan stepped forward. "You've given me more peace than I've felt in years." She smiled, though her chest ached with something she couldn't name. "I mean it, Margaret," he said. His voice wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't playful. It was raw. There was a pause. "You make me feel." He stopped himself. Margaret held up a hand, almost as if to protect them both from what was about to happen. "Ethan, you're a good man," she said quietly. "But we have to be careful. This, whatever this is, it's a feeling born of loneliness. Familiarity. Safety. We both want to feel seen." He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "I just wanted you to know that you matter to me." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "And you matter to me, too. More than I expected. More than I probably should." There was silence. Then, slowly, Ethan stepped forward, and without asking, he reached for her hand. She let him. Just that. Nothing more. It was innocent. And yet, not. Later that night, lying in bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her hands still tingling from the memory of touch. She hadn't crossed any lines. Not really. But she had stood on the edge, and the pull of emotion there was strong. The following days passed in a blur of routine, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. Margaret found herself waking earlier, walking the lakeside paths before breakfast in hopes of quieting the storm within. She told herself nothing had happened, no line had been officially crossed. But her heart said otherwise. The memory of Ethan's hand in hers, the look in his eyes, the warmth that lingered, it haunted her. She sat with her journal more often now. Pages filled with questions she couldn't answer. Was I lonely or longing? Was he just being kind, or was there more? Was I projecting my grief onto someone who happened to care? The truth was both simpler and more complicated. She felt alive again, and that terrified her. Ethan remained gentle and respectful. He gave her space, never pushing, never even mentioning the moment they'd shared. But his presence carried weight. When he entered a room, Margaret noticed. When he laughed, her chest warmed. When he glanced at her warmly from across the table, she had to remind herself to breathe. She hadn't felt that way in decades. Not since Arthur. One evening, while Daniel was away for a weekend visit to his parents, Margaret and Ethan found themselves alone once more. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of dishes being put away. "I've been thinking," Margaret said finally, her back to him. Ethan looked up from the table. "About what?" She turned, her expression steady but soft. "About how emotionally intricate feelings can be." Ethan nodded slowly. "Because it feels safe, even when it isn't?" "Exactly." There was a long pause between them, and then she moved closer gently, sitting down across from him. "I care about you, Ethan," she said, voice clear. "Truly. But I've spent too many years building a life out of ashes. I can't afford to confuse gratitude for affection, or affection for something else." His eyes didn't leave hers. "I understand. I believe you do," she said. "Which is why I need to say this. We can't go down a path that isn't ours to walk. Not because I don't care, but because I do." Ethan lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening briefly before he nodded. "I never wanted to make things complicated," he said. "They already were," she replied, her voice catching slightly. "But I'm glad we've been honest. That matters more than anything." The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was lighter, resolute. They didn't hold hands that evening. They didn't linger on the porch watching the stars. Instead, they parted with a quiet understanding. Some connections are meant to awaken us, not to bind us. That night, Margaret slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Summer slowly began to fade, the days growing shorter, the air crisp with the early scent of autumn. Daniel packed his things for the semester ahead, buzzing with excitement about new classes and the friends he'd missed. Ethan, quieter, more reflective, prepared to return with him. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching them laugh as they loaded the car, her heart full of 1,000 unspoken things. There had been no dramatic endings. No tears. Just the quiet acceptance that the season had changed, both outside and within. Ethan approached her before they left. He held out his hand, and she took it. "I meant every word I said this summer," he told her gently. "But I'm grateful for your honesty. You've helped me more than you know." Margaret nodded, her eyes misty. "You helped me too, Ethan. More than I can say." He leaned forward, and instead of a kiss, he embraced her, a warm, steady hug that held everything unspoken. Then he turned, climbed into the passenger seat, and was gone. The house felt quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. Margaret joined a local garden club later that week. She started hosting Sunday tea with her neighbors, picking up old friendships where they'd left off. She even began volunteering again at the town library, her favorite corner seat now occupied by eager schoolchildren listening to her read aloud. She still thought of Ethan sometimes. When the late afternoon light caught the lake just so, or when she saw two young men laughing in the street. But the ache was no longer heavy. It had turned into something gentler, gratitude, perhaps, for a moment that reminded her she could still feel deeply. Still grow. Still change. Epilogue, the quiet bloom. Life doesn't always give us the endings we expect. Sometimes, it offers us quiet detours that nudge us back to ourselves. For Margaret, this summer had been just that, a reminder that healing doesn't always look like solitude, and that love, in all its forms, doesn't always demand possession. Sometimes it simply asks to be acknowledged, respected, and then released. The lake, still and silver in the morning light, reflected her back to herself, older, wiser, but no less whole. And in the rhythm of her peaceful, purposeful days, Margaret finally understood. Some hearts don't need to be filled. In the quiet that followed, Margaret found herself returning to a truth she had forgotten somewhere along the way. Life doesn't stop unfolding, not at any age. It shifts, stirs, and occasionally surprises us in the most unexpected ways. What began as a simple summer visit had unraveled pieces of her she thought were buried forever, her longing to be seen not just as a grandmother or a widow, but as a whole woman. Ethan hadn't been the answer to that longing, but he had been the mirror. He reminded her of her capacity to feel, to lingering impression, to hope. And that mattered. She learned that loneliness doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it wears the face of routine. And sometimes, it only reveals itself when something, or someone, interrupts the silence. But she also learned that not every emotional awakening needs to become a love story. Some are meant to be moments of clarity, invitations to re-engage with life, with oneself, with the world. Margaret didn't regret the summer. Not a single moment. It had been honest, complicated, and deeply human. What she carried forward wasn't a sense of loss, but of expansion. She had opened her heart again, not to romance, but to possibility. And in doing so, she had rediscovered her own aliveness. In the end, the greatest lesson was this: it's never too late to feel. It's never too late to change. And it's never too late to come home to yourself.